Hello, and thank you for joining another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed. Earlier this week, Israel's Western allies took a decision to suspend funding of the UN Palestine Refugee Agency, UNRWA. It came as a huge shock, especially given the size of the humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding in Gaza due to Israel's military operation. To discuss the ramifications of that, I am joined by Dr. Lex Takkenberg. Dr. Takkenberg, welcome to MEMO Conversation.
Thank you very much, and happy to be with you.
So Lex is a Dutch national. He is currently a senior advisor with Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development and non-resident professor at the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs. Dr. Takkenberg worked with UNRWA from 1989 until 2019, and most recently as the first chief of its ethics office. Prior to that, he held a range of other positions within UNRWA. He is a law graduate from the University of Amsterdam, and his well-known book is The Status of Palestinian Refugees in International Law. Let's begin with that book itself, Lex, The Palestinian Refugees Under International Law. What are their rights, and why, after 76 years, their plight remains unresolved?
Well, I undertook the research for that book, which was initially my PhD dissertation, which I wrote during my decade in Gaza during the 1990s, out of curiosity as to why the Palestinian refugees were the only category of forced migrants that were sort of treated distinctly in the global international refugee regime as it evolved after the Second World War. I was curious about it. I didn't understand it. Why was there this special agency? I mean, I had just started to work for it. And why were they treated sort of distinctly under the 1951 Refugee Convention? And that became this book. And then just for your listeners, in my last 5 years with UNRWA, I had the good fortune to work with Francesca Albanese, the current UN Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the OPT, to completely rewrite that book. Francesca took the lead. And it was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press simply as Palestine Refugees in International Law. So the reason, in a nutshell, what sort of are their rights and what was the reason for this special treatment? When the UN General Assembly in 1949, just a few years after its establishment, after the Second World War and its establishment, was confronted with two massive refugee situations. One, the remnant of the Second World War in Europe, mostly Jewish refugees in Europe, and then an indirect consequence of the Second World War, the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians. So when the General Assembly was confronted with that, it actually created, as was typical before the Second World War, it created two refugee organizations to deal with these two distinct problems. UNHCR was the agency to deal with the refugee issue in Europe, and UNRWA was set up to deal specifically with the Palestinian refugee situation. And that was because they had sort of specific needs, specific circumstances. The context was very different. Now, UNHCR later, much later, after 1967, became the global refugee organization that we know it to be today. But as at that time the Palestinian refugee question was still not resolved, and UNRWA was a massive actor to provide humanitarian support and human development services, education, health, social services to the refugees. The two organizations existed in parallel. why is after 75 years the situation not conclusively resolved? Well, it's the absence of a broader political settlement for the question of Palestine. The refugees are entitled, and that is a firm entitlement, different from what Israeli advocates sort of try to portray, that the right of return is just a recommendation from the General Assembly in Resolution 194. No, the right of return, or the sort of the determination of the UN General Assembly at the time that the refugees be allowed to return to their original homes flows from the illegality of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the legal consequences of that. We're talking 48 when Resolution 194 was adopted, December 48, just 2 years after the Nuremberg tribunals in Germany after the Second World War. Both in the charter of the Nuremberg tribunals and in the judgments of the tribunal, forced population transfer and forced displacement of populations during the war in Europe was explicitly acknowledged to already constitute war crimes under the law as it stood at the times. And the General Assembly diplomats that extensively drafted 194. 194 also creates this conciliation commission for Palestine, so it was quite a complex resolution. Knew very well that this was the law. They just applied the law, and so that is the basic right of the refugees. And as we know, Israel has prevented this from materializing until this very moment. At the same time, the refugees are in host countries that have, for the most generously hosted them, but knowing this state of international law, knowing the wish of the refugees to return, the host countries have by and large not really fully absorbed them. I mean, Jordan is an exception that had to do with territorial aspirations of the then King Abdullah, that wanted to sort of restore the Bilad Sham. But Syria and Lebanon, and also the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, have not given citizenship. In addition to being refugees, the Palestinians there are also stateless persons, and so their unresolved plight tragically continues to this very day.
So all in all, there's 5.6 million registered Palestinian refugees with UNRWA. And we know, I mean, the legal right is not in dispute. The right to return is moral, legal, and just. That's not in being contested. Going back to your point about UNRWA, and then the international community set up 2 refugee agencies, UNHCR and UNRWA. UNHCR, as we know, it also works towards settling the refugee problems in the arenas it works in, such as repatriation, compensation, and return. So UNRWA took over took the mandate of providing humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. So why is there not an agency looking after with the mandate of returning Palestinians, repatriating them, and also compensating them for their ethnic cleansing? Because I know before UNRWA, there was another refugee agency, UNCCP, United Nations Conciliatory Committee for Palestine, which was set up with that mandate. So what happened to that? Why is there what is called a protection gap when it comes to Palestinian refugees? Even though right at the outset, the international community, based on its legal obligation, recognized that Palestinians have a right of return, they set up an institution for that very fact, for that very purpose, I mean.
Correct.
So what happened to UNCCP? Just take us through that history, and then we'll move on to the current situation.
Yeah, very good and very important points also in the today's sort of context. I mentioned 194, and I said it took time to negotiate because exactly this UNCCP was set up to deal with the, they sort of took over from the initial UN mediator, Count Bernadotte, who had in his first progress report mentioned and urged Israel to allow the refugees to return. And a day after he submitted it, he was assassinated by Jewish extremists for making that recommendation. So the General Assembly between September, when he was killed, and December, when 194 was adopted, deliberated how to go about it, and they decided to establish indeed this UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, comprised of member states instead of individual named individuals. So it became the US, Turkey, and France to lead that commission or that committee. The mandate was indeed the return of the refugees, but also more broadly trying to negotiate an overall political settlement to sort of the conflict as it has escalated from May 48 and into the war. So the Conciliation Commission tried, went to see Ben Gurion and said, you have to take the refugees back. This is first your legal obligation, and this is second what the UN General Assembly has resolved. And Ben Gurion essentially said, forget it. We're still struggling to establish ourselves. If we allow the refugees to return, the demographic dynamics dramatically change to our detriment. We won't do it. And then in the coming months there was some opening for compromise. Israel said at one point we might consider 250,000 out of so 1/3 of the caseload, and one option of doing that was by saying we will take responsibility for, or we will incorporate the Gaza Strip in Israel, so that the refugees there become sort of Israeli citizens of Palestinian origin. But then the Arab states said, this is law. You cannot compromise on this, and so they totally rejected it. And then Israel said, well, if that's the case, we also withdraw our offer. And so 6-7 months, towards the Conciliation Commission started working in January. By the summer, they sort of came to the conclusion, we're never going to succeed in getting the refugees back. So we must begin to look at alternatives. Now, in any refugee situation, this is the case for UNHCR, and this is the case for the UNCCP when it was sort of looking at the Palestinian refugee question. And this is the case also historically for, in dealing with other refugee situations. There are always three possibilities: voluntary return to the place where the refugees come from, seen as the ideal solution because it restores the refugees to their home country, to their culture, to their families, to whatever. It makes it's logical that this is the ideal solution. If that does not work, you can try to integrate, to sort of legally, economically integrate the refugees in the host countries where they have found sort of their initial asylum. If for whatever reason that also does not work, the third option is resettlement in third countries. So the UNCCP was sort of aware of this framework and said, if return is as we see not going to happen, and there's little opportunity to really force Israel to return, also under the political constellation as it stood at the time, they started focusing on integration. Now, how do we integrate 750,000 Palestinians into sort of the societies and economies of the host country? They were sort of brainstorming about that. And then the then American ambassador in Cairo said, we did this great public works scheme in the Tennessee Valley TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Let's bring Gordon Clapp, the president of the TVA, to do a feasibility study and see whether, you know, some of those approaches could also work in the Jordan Valley, in the northern Sinai, which at the time they were thinking of sort of, you know, adding to Gaza, and the Euphrates basin in Syria. And Gordon Clapp came in the fall of 49 to the region, traveled around, had lots of coffees and teas with Arab leaders, and sort of naively left under the impression that, you know, a similar scheme was possible in the Near East. And so the Americans said, okay, leading, you know, as the chairs of the UNCCP, we need an organization that can you know, take on that reintegration task. At the same time, autumn 49, the international NGOs that had provided the initial relief to the Palestinian refugees, the Quakers in Gaza, American Friends Service Committee Quakers in Gaza, the ICRC in the Palestine and Jordan, and the League of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in Lebanon and Syria, they said, you know, we have done our best, but this really goes beyond our capacity. As of the end of April 1950, the UN has to take it over, or someone else has to take it over. We won't continue anymore. So the Conciliation Commission was confronted with those two sort of issues, the need to provide for continued relief, humanitarian assistance in today's parlance, and the need to set up an agency to carry out these large-scale public work, labor-intensive public work schemes that Mr. Clapp had proposed. And that became the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA.
Can I just get a quick sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Quick clarification on the three options you mentioned that refugees under international law have, which is the right of return, compensation, and integration. So those options, of course, have to be done in consultation with the refugees.
Absolutely.
It's the refugees who give permission for which option they want to exercise. It's not something which a third party can come and say, oh, we want you to adopt integration. We're going to force this option on you. So the point of those three options is that it's the refugees ultimately who exercise the option.
However, with a caveat, return is a legal right under international law. Integration means granting asylum in the countries where the refugees initially find themselves. That is a sovereign act of the host countries. The refugees have a right to seek asylum, but not necessarily under international refugee law to be granted asylum. And this is why, you know, you can say it's horrific how, for example, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon have, you know, had a very precarious situation over the past 75 years. You know, Lebanon refused to grant them full asylum. They have just said, you know, we tolerate them until such time as they can return home, but that's about it. So yes, the refugee intentions are critical, but you know, the international legal dimensions can also not be overlooked. You know, a state cannot be forced. The host countries could not legally be forced to accept them. The same goes for third country resettlement. You know, we see refugees from, for example, after or during the war in Syria, there were Syrians who got into Lebanon, Syrian refugees into Lebanon, and they got, in, you know, medical cases, people with disabilities got resettled in third countries. That is also not a right. That is something that UNHCR, you know, tries to solicit resettlement places. But the extent to which this can happen depends again on sovereign decisions of resettlement countries. And there was an ironic, and this comes also to the fact that no longer the UNCCP exists, and indeed UNRWA has failed to step into that vacuum. Among the refugees from Syria in Lebanon, there were also Palestinian refugees, the so-called PRS, Palestinian refugees from Syria. And they also had, disabled members, people with chronic diseases, and they saw what was happening to Syrian refugees under those circumstances. And they went to UNHCR and said, can we also benefit from those schemes? And UNHCR said, you're outside UNHCR's area of operation, so we cannot mediate, we cannot open this option for you. And then they went to UNRWA, and UNRWA said, well, we do not do durable solutions. We do not engage in the quest for durable solutions. And that is indeed a protection gap. And if you allow me, so I mentioned the Conciliation Commission as efforts to try to achieve return. Then they sort of changed course. And I've been saying, UNRWA was born in original sin, because in December 48, the General Assembly sort of promised the refugees, you can return, you should return. And 12 months later, they created an agency that sort of took a 180-degree different course. No, sorry, refugees, you have to integrate in the host countries where you are. Initially, there was not even reference to 194 in the resolution. The draft resolution just referred to an agency, a relief and works agent, a UN relief and works agency for the Near East. And the Arab states said, well, 12 months ago, we spoke about return. Where has that gone? And then sort of they added in the drafting process, that in the preamble, that this is without jeopardy to the right of return, to resolution 194. And they added that this was an agency specifically for Palestine refugees, and not a sort of a general development agency. But yet UNRWA was created with this American agenda or Western agenda in mind, trying to relieve Israel of the pressure of the refugee return. And that's why the relationship of the refugees vis-a-vis UNRWA, the relationship of the Arab states, and much later, as we see today, the relationship also with Israel has been complicated. Now, what happened to the UNCCP? After UNRWA was created, the UNCCP, and you mentioned compensation and restitution, the UNCCP carried out a massive 15-year-long survey of Palestinian properties that were left behind. It meticulously documented every piece of property that the refugees, the Palestinians who got displaced, owned, in consultation and cooperation with refugee representatives, and sort of there was no electronic database at the time, but they set up a system of classification. They also started computing the value of the properties, and it goes to incredible detail. There are records for an individual olive tree, where it's located, how old it is, and really it's an incredible level of detail. Now, after 15 years, or during those 15 years, there were still a few attempts at sort of a renewed pressure on Israel to take the refugees back. In the book that Francesca and I wrote, we document all of these efforts, and there's also a brilliant book by Michael Fischbach, Records of Dispossession, who he wrote a book specifically on the UNCCP property effort. So if people want to know more, that's a fantastic book.
Yeah. If I
yes.
I want to just move the conversation forward. I mean, when I look at the refugee issue, and listening to you, it just reinforces the idea that the Palestinian situation, of refugee crisis in particular, is dealt with in a completely different way. There's all in the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel is always exceptionalized. There are existing tools, there are existing regimes under international law with which to deal with these problems. It's not like these issues have not existed. It's not like there aren't tools and regimes and legal systems with which to address those problems. But it's ever since 1948, there's always been an effort to exceptionalize the Palestinian issue, whether it be the refugees, whether it be settlements. Settlements are illegal, clearly, but of course, when it comes to Israel,
Yeah,
it's all fine. So that's
yeah.
another example of that. But as I said, I want to move the conversation forward and bring us up to date with the current crisis. We will get to the question about why UNRWA has constantly been under Israeli attack. But just give us your thoughts on the decision itself to suspend funding. To a lot of people, it seems like collective punishment. It's based on an allegation, and we've now seen further details. Instead of 12, there's probably 4. It's just allegations, and based on an allegation, they undertook such a draconian, such an inhumane decision to cut funding, especially when Palestinians need this funding more than ever. So can you see this in any other way other than collective punishment?
I completely agree with you, and I see it in the donor response. I see it in absolutely as a measure of collective punishment. But one step further, the news broke, and I'm convinced it's not a coincidence, on the day that the ICJ, or even at the hour the ICJ last Friday gave its ruling, finding a prima facie, a plausible case of genocide, and issuing 6 orders to Israel. Now, one of these orders had to do with Israel sort of blocking off aid into the Gaza Strip. And Israel was ordered to, allow aid fully and in the scale that is needed into the Strip. Now, what do donors do? The most important aid agency on the ground, UNRWA, that is the only agency that has the capacity, the warehouses, the staff, the trucks, the personnel to deliver that aid. What do? They suspend their financial contributions to that organization. Under the Genocide Convention, it's not only sort of Israel that is targeted over the situation in Gaza, but also all the other 150 or so member states through the Genocide Convention have to make sure that they refrain, that they are not complicit in the commission of genocide. So under those circumstances, with that very stark not just warning but order of the International Court of Justice, by suspending aid, all the agencies, donors that are party to the Genocide Convention, I think it's all of them, are complicit in genocide. It's as simple as that, and it's really, really, really shocking. If there would have been a report that a handful of perhaps UNRWA doctors or teachers had engaged in sexual misconduct towards pupils, nobody would have said, well, yes, UNRWA must investigate, but they would not have suspended aid over it. It's unthinkable, and it's like, you have a public health system, and there are certain doctors who are misbehaving, and you completely suspend funding to that entire system. That's what we've seen. So yeah, not just collective punishment, but which is an international crime, but complicity in genocide here. Really, really shocking.
Yeah, and the stark contrast is the world's highest legal authority says Israel's potentially committing genocide. Western allies will keep silent. They won't do anything.
Silent.
And then Israel comes along and says, oh, we potentially found 4 or 5, UNRWA staff who may have
Exactly.
been part of
Exactly.
October 7 attack. Everyone cuts their funding. I mean, the hypocrisy
Yeah.
for a lot of people is just so
Yeah.
stark. It's unbelievable.
Please allow me to, put this UNRWA-Israel relationship quickly in sort of a context. Until from 48, or no, from 50 when UNRWA started until 67, UNRWA had very little to do with Israel. The aid operation in Gaza and in the West Bank went through Jordan and Egypt, respectively. So during the 67 war, I think already on day 3, the Israeli Minister of Defense reached out to UNRWA's Commissioner General in Beirut at the time and said, you must continue providing your assistance in the Gaza Strip. And in a matter of 2 or 3 days, an exchange of letter was conducted. The Comey-Mitchell-Moore agreement, that stipulated UNRWA's continued provision of assistance with at the full request of Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. And that continues to be the legal framework for UNRWA's work in Gaza and the West Bank to this very moment. Now, whilst on the one hand, Israel sort of needed UNRWA and continues to need UNRWA, even today you see that. I think yesterday there was one of the senior Israeli military that sort of said, yes, it's not desirable to sort of replace UNRWA, to close UNRWA down. So that's on the one hand, they need the agency. On the other hand, with 99.9% local staff, and this makes UNRWA, one of the, I've always said, it's one of the agencies that involves the refugee community to the maximum extent possible in its work. All the doctors, the nurses, the social workers, the counselors, the psychologists, the middle managers, the junior managers, the middle managers, all the logistic people, they're all Palestinian refugees themselves, helping their own people. In today's world where in the international humanitarian and aid debate, there is the buzzword is localization. Work with local entities to deliver your aid. UNRWA has done that from day one. Now, so on the one hand, that's laudable. On the other hand, for Israel, it meant, it's a large organization with only 0.1% international staff. We don't really trust you. And not only do we not really trust you, they also discovered as part of their, propaganda, their hasbara, their public, their attempts at influencing the public discourse that you refer to, that sort of has driven this exceptionalism, that UNRWA was sort of the weak underbelly of the UN system. You could easily attack UNRWA when it suited you to sort of deflect attention from either negative publicity about Israeli action or more generally to sort of criticize the credibility of the UN system. So they started attacking the textbooks that are being used in UNRWA schools and that might contain, or that on occasion contained, sort of glorification of violence or other anti-Semitic sort of tropes. Now, these textbooks were not UNRWA textbooks. They were textbooks used in the host countries. Textbooks always reflect sort of the state of play and the state of relations between states in terms of, especially in situations of conflict. Rather than attacking Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon or Syria, they attacked UNRWA because it was easy, and then UNRWA donor representatives sort of jumped on that and said, well, you have to really vet and check and censor the textbooks that you're using. Same with use of UNRWA installation. There's a donor visit, they see a school, and then they see in the room of the headmistress or headmaster, they see a map of historic Palestine without Israel carved out. Oh, a scandal! UNRWA is teaching, the jihad and the right of return and so forth. So social media post of UNRWA personnel, since the 2014 war, when there was really, the war was for the first time covered broadly on social media. So attacks on the social media used by UNRWA personnel, and then also occasional attacks on UNRWA, the local staff unions of UNRWA being taken over by Hamas in Gaza, for example. Again, a frequent refrain. So we have, whereas on the one hand, Israel sort of needed UNRWA as an operational agency. On the other hand, they saw it was an easy target to accuse with allegations that often cannot be verified. So Israel is just saying, yes, in the current case, You know, there were 12 staff involved in 7 October. It has given a dossier which contained, you know, the name of the people, their titles in UNRWA, and what they were supposed to have done, but zero evidence. And up to this moment, as far as I'm aware, UNRWA and also the UN oversight body, OIOS in New York, have not received these details. You know, UNRWA said, the UN said, we will immediately investigate. But I'm sure this investigation has started with a request to Israel to please provide the evidence. Then we can start checking it, and then we can start, you know, holding those staff accountable. And in many, I worked for 30 years with UNRWA. I was the director of legal. I was director of operations agency-wide. I worked a decade in Gaza. I was chief of ethics. In many of those earlier instances where UNRWA personnel were alleged of wrongdoing, the evidence never came. And then, you know, UNRWA had no choice but to close the investigation several months later due to lack of evidence. And in the meantime, Israel had achieved its objective of deflecting attention away from sort of the issue of the day, which last Friday was the, you know, the very powerful ICJ ruling.
Yeah, and this, I think this is exactly what's happening right now with these allegations. As I said, I think 12 has been reduced to 4, and even then, that there isn't any proof to,
No, the evidence isn't there.
The evidence isn't there. And we should also add that UNRWA has lost more staff in this latest aggression than in its history. Hundreds of UNRWA staff have been killed. And
in the entire UN system, there has never been a conflict where there's been such a massive loss of human life. You know, I think 152 or 153 up till this moment, and probably, you know, many more under the rubble. I spoke recently to earthquake specialists that sort of, you know, they often say, you know, the known death toll might double once serious rubble removal and explosive ordnance removal begins. You know, so it's unprecedented. And I was just reading an email that one of the local staff shared with me. You know, I worked so long in Gaza that I still have a lot of sort of former colleagues, and they reach out to me sometimes. You know, the meticulous work with which sort of the logisticians and the warehouse people in the south of Gaza, you know, do their work in you know, never knowing, you know, if they say goodbye to their families in the morning to go to work, whether they will come home alive. And yet, you know, they're so determined to support, you know, their people under distress that they, day in, day out, you know, thousands and thousands of UNRWA workers risk their life to provide much needed relief. And yes, there are many other agencies involved in the relief effort, especially bringing in supplies, bringing in much needed medical supplies. But the only organization that is physically able to deliver it, in addition to the Palestinian Red Crescent, is UNRWA. You know, so UNRWA is not just a lifeline directly to the Palestinians and the Palestinian refugees in particular, but also to the entire humanitarian system. You know, if WHO wants to bring medication to hospitals in the north, it is UNRWA trucks that provide that service to their sister agency.
Lex, we've covered a lot of grounds, and I know you're rushed for time. I want to thank you for joining us. You've given us so much to think about, and also amazing history you provided for our viewers as well. And I want to thank our viewers as well. You've been listening to Conversation with the Middle East Monitor with today's host, Naseem Ahmed. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Professor Lex. And see you again for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor.
With pleasure, with pleasure.